Frank Morrison had seen enough violence for 3 lifetimes, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed through his kitchen window that Tuesday morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The 68-year-old Afghanistan veteran was pouring his second cup of coffee when the screaming started from the house next door. Not the usual raised voices that had become background noise over the past 8 months, but something different. Something that made his hands shake with a fury he hadn't felt since Kandahar. What Frank did next would either save a life or destroy everything he'd built in his quiet retirement. But first, let me tell you how a decorated war hero became the most unlikely guardian angel in a small Midwestern town, and why sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought not on foreign soil, but right in your own backyard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Morrison's days followed a rhythm as precise as his military training had been 30 years earlier. Up at 0500 hours, coffee black and strong, scanned the local news on his tablet while the sun painted the Iowa cornfields in shades of amber and gold. The duplex he bought after his wife Helen's death 2 years ago sat on Maple Street, a quiet residential area where the biggest excitement usually involved Mrs. Peterson's cat getting stuck in her apple tree. The morning routine was sacred to Frank, an anchor of normalcy in a world that sometimes still felt foreign after decades of military service. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless classified operations that lived in the shadows of his memory had taught him the value of peaceful moments. At 68, his weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen humanity at its worst and somehow maintained faith in its capacity for better. The duplex had been Helen's idea, proposed during one of their last conversations in the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. "Buy something small, Frank," she'd whispered, her voice thin from the chemotherapy that ultimately couldn't save her. "Somewhere quiet where you can finally rest, but not too isolated. You need neighbors, even if you don't think you do." Helen had been right about most things during their 42 years of marriage, and this was no exception. The duplex on Maple Street provided just enough human contact to keep him anchored without overwhelming his need for solitude. The elderly couple on his left, Robert and Dorothy Chun, were retired teachers who kept a beautiful garden and occasionally brought him homemade dumplings. Their conversations were comfortable and brief, exactly what Frank needed. The house on his right had been empty when he moved in, a small 2-bedroom rental that the landlord struggled to fill in a town where most people owned their homes. Frank had enjoyed the privacy, using the quiet to process his grief and adjust to civilian life without Helen's steadying presence. The silence had been healing, a balm for nerves that had been raw since her death. That changed 8 months ago when the new tenants moved in. Bernard Kellerman was 73 years old, a retired insurance adjuster from Chicago who walked with a slight limp and complained loudly about everything from the weather to the mailman's timing. His voice carried the permanent irritation of someone who had never learned to find satisfaction in life, regardless of circumstances. Frank's initial attempts at neighborly conversation had been met with grunts and complaints about city taxes, government overreach, and the general decline of American values. What struck Frank as odd wasn't Bernard's cantankerous nature. He'd met plenty of bitter old men in his time, but the woman who lived with him, Jessica Kellerman, was 34 years old, nearly 40 years younger than her husband, with the kind of subdued beauty that seemed to apologize for its existence. She had honey-colored hair that she wore pulled back in a simple ponytail, green eyes that rarely met anyone's gaze directly, and a way of moving through the world as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. When Frank had first seen her helping Bernard unload boxes from a moving truck, his immediate thought had been, she must be his daughter or caregiver. The truth, revealed through overheard conversations and observed interactions, was more complicated. Jessica was Bernard's wife, Married just over a year, according to the few details Frank had pieced together from their arguments that sometimes carried through the thin walls of the duplex. The age gap alone wasn't what bothered Frank. He'd seen enough of the world to know that relationships came in all configurations. What bothered him was the way Jessica moved through her daily routine with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. She did the grocery shopping alone, always in the early morning when fewer people were around. Frank had encountered her a few times at the local Hy-Vee, where she moved through the aisles with a shopping list clutched in her hand and rarely spoke beyond polite greetings. Her cart was always filled with the same items: frozen dinners for one, basic toiletries, cleaning supplies, and an occasional book or magazine that she would slip beneath other items as if hiding a guilty pleasure. Frank noticed details because noticing details had kept him alive in war zones where overlooking the small things could get you and your squad killed. Jessica wore long sleeves even in Iowa's humid summers. She parked Bernard's car. Apparently she didn't have one of her own in the exact same spot each time, as if deviation from routine might trigger consequences. She never seemed to have visitors, never received packages addressed to her specifically, and never appeared to leave the house for any reason other than necessary errands. Most telling were the sounds that drifted through the shared wall between their houses. Bernard's voice was a constant presence, commanding, criticizing, demanding. Frank could make out the tone if not always the words. Sharp corrections about how Jessica was loading the dishwasher, harsh critiques of her cooking, lengthy monologues about her failures to meet his expectations. Jessica's responses, when audible at all, were apologetic murmurs that seemed designed to deflect rather than engage. Frank had initially tried to dismiss his growing concerns as the hypervigilance of a combat veteran adjusting to civilian life. Military training created habits of threat assessment that didn't easily shut off, and sometimes innocent situations triggered responses calibrated for war zones rather than suburban neighborhoods. Helen had helped him recognize when his protective instincts were misplaced, gently redirecting his focus when he read danger into ordinary circumstances. Without Helen's moderating influence, Frank found himself paying closer attention to the dynamics next door than was probably healthy or appropriate. He told himself he was simply being a concerned neighbor, but the truth was more complex. Something about Jessica's carefully controlled movements and Bernard's domineering presence activated every protective instinct Frank had developed during decades of military service. The first time Frank heard what sounded like a physical altercation. He'd been washing dishes after dinner on a Thursday evening in late March. The argument had started typically, Bernard's voice raised in criticism about something Jessica had apparently done wrong. But then the tone shifted, becoming sharper and more menacing, followed by a sound that Frank's experience identified immediately, the distinctive thud of a hand striking flesh. Frank had frozen at his kitchen sink, dish soap dripping from the plate in his hands as he strained to hear what was happening next door. Jessica's voice had risen briefly in what sounded like protest or pain, quickly silenced by Bernard's sharp command to keep your voice down. The house had gone quiet after that, an ominous silence that Frank recognized from combat situations, where violence had ended one confrontation but promised future escalation. He'd spent the next hour pacing his living room, debating whether to call the police, knock on their door, or mind his own business. The rational part of his mind argued that he might have misinterpreted what he'd heard, that domestic disputes were complex situations where outside intervention often made things worse, that a single incident didn't necessarily indicate a pattern of abuse. The veteran part of his mind, the part trained to recognize threats and protect the innocent, knew better. Over the following months, the incidents had become more frequent and more intense. Frank learned to recognize the warning signs, Bernard's voice taking on a particular edge of frustration, usually late in the evening after he'd been drinking, the sound of furniture being moved roughly, Jessica's voice becoming higher and more desperate before being cut off entirely. The conspicuous silence that followed, broken only by the sound of Bernard's television being turned up to mask whatever was happening in other parts of their house. Frank had called the Cedar Falls Police Department twice, reporting domestic disturbances from the address next door. Both times, officers had responded promptly and professionally, spending perhaps 20 minutes at the Kellerman house before leaving without making any arrests. Frank had watched from his window as the police spoke with Bernard at the front door, conversations that appeared cordial and brief. Jessica had been visible during the second visit, standing behind Bernard with her arms crossed defensively, nodding along with whatever explanations he was providing. After the officers left, Frank had heard Bernard's voice through the walls, not angry but coldly instructional, explaining to Jessica exactly what would happen if she ever contradicted his version of events to outside authorities again. Frank's military training had included instruction on recognizing and responding to various forms of psychological warfare, including the techniques used to break down enemy resistance through systematic isolation and intimidation. What he was observing next door bore uncomfortable similarities to those methods: control of resources and mobility, social isolation, constant criticism designed to undermine self-worth, and the threat of escalating consequences for any resistance. Problem was that Frank's training had prepared him to respond to clear military threats with appropriate force, not to navigate the complex legal and social constraints surrounding domestic violence in civilian contexts. His instincts told him to intervene directly, to confront Bernard and extract Jessica from what was clearly a dangerous situation. His experience told him that such an approach would likely make things worse for everyone involved and could result in his own arrest or restraining order. So Frank had settled into a pattern of careful observation and documentation, keeping a detailed log of incidents he witnessed or overheard, photographing Jessica's car when it showed new damage, noting patterns in their daily routines that might indicate escalating control or isolation. He'd researched local domestic violence resources, memorizing phone numbers and procedures, preparing for the moment when Jessica might reach out for help. That moment had never come. Instead, Frank watched Jessica's world grow smaller and more controlled with each passing week. Her trips to the grocery store became less frequent and more hurried. Her interactions with neighbors dwindled to polite nods when their paths crossed while checking mail. The books and magazines that had once appeared in her shopping cart disappeared entirely, replaced by an even more utilitarian selection of necessities. Frank began timing his own activities to coincide with Jessica's outdoor chores, hoping to create opportunities for conversation that might allow her to ask for help or at least know that someone was paying attention. But Jessica had become expert at avoiding extended contact with anyone, including well-meaning neighbors who might ask questions she couldn't safely answer. The few times Frank had managed brief conversations with her discussing the weather, while they both checked their mail, commenting on the Chun's garden when they happened to be outside simultaneously, Jessica had been polite but guarded. Her responses were carefully neutral, designed to discourage follow-up questions while maintaining the appearance of normal, neighborly interaction. Frank recognized the behavior because he'd seen it in Afghan villages where civilians had learned to navigate between government forces and Taliban insurgents, saying exactly what each group wanted to hear while revealing nothing that could be used against them later. Jessica was employing survival tactics in her own home, and that realization filled Frank with a fury that he struggled to contain. As summer turned to fall and the incidents next door continued to escalate in frequency and apparent severity, Frank found himself facing a dilemma that went to the core of his identity. He was a man trained to protect the innocent and confront evil, living next door to a situation that demanded exactly that kind of intervention. But he was also a civilian now, bound by laws and social conventions that prioritized individual privacy over collective responsibility for protecting the vulnerable. The tension between his protective instincts and legal constraints was eating away at Frank's carefully maintained equilibrium. His sleep became irregular, interrupted by hypervigilance whenever he heard voices or movement from next door. His appetite decreased as anxiety about Jessica's situation overshadowed his own daily needs. He found himself checking on the Kellerman house at all hours, looking for signs that violence had escalated beyond verbal and psychological abuse into something that might require immediate medical intervention. Frank's isolation made the situation worse. Helen had been his sounding board for complex moral decisions, helping him think through the implications of different courses of action. Without her counsel, Frank found himself cycling through the same arguments again and again, weighing the risks of action against the moral cost of inaction, calculating probabilities and consequences with military precision, but reaching no satisfactory conclusions. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in early November, when the autumn chill had settled over Cedar Falls and the cornfields around town had been harvested down to stubble. Frank was following his normal routine, coffee and news in the pre-dawn darkness, when the screaming started from next door. This wasn't the familiar pattern of Bernard's criticism escalating into Jessica's defensive responses. This was different, raw, desperate, the sound of someone in immediate physical danger. Frank's coffee mug hit the kitchen counter as he moved to the window, his body already shifting into the alert readiness that had served him in combat zones around the world. Through the early morning darkness, Frank could see lights on in the Kellerman house and shadows moving behind drawn curtains. The screaming continued, punctuated by sounds of struggle in Bernard's voice, no longer coldly controlling but hot with rage. Something had changed in the dynamic next door. Some line had been crossed that transformed months of psychological torture into active physical violence. Frank Morrison stood at his kitchen window, 68 years old and officially retired from active duty, watching evil unfold 20 feet from his morning coffee. Every instinct trained into him by decades of military service demanded immediate action. Every lesson learned about civilian life counseled caution and proper procedures. In the distance, a siren wailed ambulance or police, impossible to tell. The screaming from next door had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that Frank recognized from too many battlefields where the absence of sound meant either safety or death. Frank Morrison had 30 seconds to decide whether he was still a soldier or just another civilian neighbor who minded his own business. The choice would define not only his own future, but the life of the woman next door who had been fighting a war of survival in her own home while the world looked the other way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Frank Morrison didn't hesitate. 30 years of military conditioning overrode 8 months of civilian restraint as he moved through his house with the fluid efficiency of a soldier responding to contact. The spare key to his back door went into his pocket along with his cell phone. His service pistol, a Sig Sauer P226 that had accompanied him through 3 combat deployments, emerged from the gun safe where it had sat unused since Helen's funeral. Muscle memory was still there, checking the magazine, chambering around, engaging the safety movements so automatic they required no conscious thought. Frank's hands were steady now, the tremor from his morning coffee replaced by the focused calm that had kept him alive in Kandahar and Fallujah. The silence from next door had stretched too long. In Frank's experience, when violence stopped abruptly, it meant one of 3 things. The situation had been resolved, the aggressor had been interrupted, or someone was seriously hurt. Given Bernard Kellerman's pattern of escalating control and Jessica's increasingly desperate attempts to comply with his demands, Frank suspected the worst. He approached the shared property line through his backyard, moving with the tactical awareness that had become second nature during urban combat operations. The Kellerman house showed lights in what Frank knew to be the kitchen and living room. but the bedroom windows facing his duplex remained dark. Most tellingly, Bernard's voice, usually a constant presence during these incidents, was completely absent. Frank's military training had included extensive instruction on domestic entry techniques, but those skills had been designed for hostile environments where the goal was neutralizing enemy combatants. This situation required different considerations: civilian legal constraints, the possibility that Jessica might be injured and need immediate medical attention, and the complex dynamics of domestic violence where victims sometimes protected their abusers even when rescue was available. The back door to the Kellerman house was accessible through a small patio that connected to Frank's own yard via a low hedge. Frank had observed Bernard's security habits over the months and knew that the older man relied primarily on front door locks, considering his backyard sufficiently private to leave the rear entrance secured only by a simple deadbolt. Frank approached the back door and listened carefully for any sounds from inside. The house remained eerily quiet, but he could detect the faint hum of electrical appliances and the distant murmur of a television. More importantly, he could smell something that triggered immediate alarm: the metallic scent of blood, faint but unmistakable to someone who had spent years in environments where such detection could mean the difference between life and death. A soft knock on the back door produced no response. Frank tried the handle and found it locked, but the door itself was old and poorly fitted to its frame. A quick examination revealed that the deadbolt assembly was loose, probably the result of the building's age and Iowa's extreme temperature, variations causing the wood to expand and contract. Frank had two choices: break down the door and risk escalating whatever situation waited inside, or find another way to gain entry that might allow him to assess the threat before committing to direct confrontation. His combat experience suggested that information was always preferable to blind action, even when time was critical. The kitchen window facing Frank's property was positioned about 4 feet above ground level, high enough to discourage casual intrusion but accessible to someone with Frank's height and upper body strength. More importantly, the window offered a direct view into the kitchen and partial sightlines into the living room, where most of the earlier sounds had originated. Frank used an overturned flower pot to boost himself to window level, taking care to move quietly despite his urgency. What he saw through the kitchen window confirmed his worst fears and triggered every protective instinct his military service had developed. Jessica Kellerman sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator, her clothing disheveled, and her face showing the distinctive swelling and discoloration of recent impact. She was conscious but appeared dazed, one hand pressed against her left temple where blood had dried in her hair. Her other arm was held protectively across her ribs in a way that suggested possible injury beyond what was immediately visible. Bernard Kellerman stood over her with his back to the window, his posture aggressive and his voice a low, threatening monotone that Frank could hear but not understand through the glass. In his right hand, Bernard held what appeared to be a heavy wooden cutting board, raising and lowering it in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate and threaten. Frank had seen enough combat to recognize the body language of someone preparing to inflict serious harm. Bernard's stance, the way he held the improvised weapon, and his position relative to Jessica all indicated that this was not a moment of heated argument but a calculated escalation toward potentially lethal violence. The tactical situation was clear: an armed aggressor with demonstrated willingness to use violence, an injured victim with limited mobility, and no indication that law enforcement was aware of the immediate danger. Frank's military training provided a straightforward response protocol for such scenarios, but civilian considerations complicated the decision matrix significantly. Breaking into a neighbor's house, even to prevent what appeared to be imminent violence, could result in serious legal consequences for Frank if he had misread the situation. If Jessica chose to protect Bernard despite her injuries, If Bernard was legally justified in his actions according to some circumstance, Frank didn't understand. Then Frank's intervention could transform him from concerned neighbor into armed intruder facing assault charges. But Frank's combat experience had also taught him to recognize the moments when hesitation killed people. Jessica's position on the floor, her obvious injuries, and Bernard's threatening posture with a potential weapon created a scenario where immediate intervention might be the only thing standing between a domestic violence incident and a homicide. Frank Morrison had spent 3 decades making split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. This wasn't different enough to paralyze him with indecision. The kitchen window's latch was old and corroded, designed for an era when home security was less of a concern in small Iowa towns. Frank's combat knife, a fixed-blade Kabar that had accompanied him through multiple deployments, made quick work of the simple mechanism. The window slid open with only a slight scraping sound that was masked by Bernard's ongoing monologue. Frank pulled himself through the window with the fluid motion of someone who had entered countless buildings under hostile conditions. His boots hit the kitchen linoleum silently, and he immediately positioned himself with the kitchen island between himself and Bernard's location near the refrigerator. Jessica saw him first, her eyes widening with surprise and fear rather than relief. Frank recognized the reaction from civilian populations in war zones. The arrival of armed soldiers was often as frightening as the threats they came to address, especially when those civilians had learned to distrust anyone claiming to offer protection. Frank raised his left hand in a calming gesture while keeping his right hand near his weapon, a compromise between reassurance and readiness that his training had taught him to maintain in uncertain situations. He made eye contact with Jessica and nodded slightly, hoping to communicate that he was there to help without alerting Bernard to his presence. Bernard continued his threatening speech, apparently unaware that his victim now had a potential protector standing 6 feet behind him. Frank used those seconds to assess the complete tactical situation. Bernard appeared unarmed except for the cutting board. Jessica's injuries seemed serious but not immediately life-threatening, and the kitchen layout provided multiple options for controlling the confrontation, depending on how Bernard responded to Frank's presence. "Bernard," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority he had used to de-escalate tense situations with both enemy combatants and allied forces. "I think that's enough." Bernard Kellerman spun around with the startled motion of someone who had believed himself to be in complete control of his environment. His face showed the flushed anger of a man accustomed to absolute authority being challenged. But Frank could also see calculation behind the rage Bernard was evaluating this new threat and considering his options. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Bernard demanded, raising the cutting board in a way that transformed it from intimidation tool to potential weapon. "This is breaking and entering. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Frank replied, his own voice remaining steady. "I already did. They're on their way." It was a bluff, but Frank's military experience had taught him the value of controlling information flow during confrontations. If Bernard believed that law enforcement was imminent, he might be less likely to escalate the violence or attempt to eliminate witnesses to his abuse. "You have no right to be here," Bernard continued. But Frank noticed that he had lowered the cutting board slightly and taken a half step away from Jessica. "This is a private matter between husband and wife. Get out before I have you arrested." Frank glanced at Jessica, who remained on the floor but was now watching the confrontation between the two men with an expression that mixed hope and terror. She had clearly been conditioned to expect that any interference in Bernard's control would result in worse consequences for her later, but she was also desperate enough to hope that someone might finally be able to stop the escalating violence. "Here's what's going to happen, Bernard," Frank said, using the tone of command that had gotten young soldiers to follow orders in life-and-death situations. "You're going to set down that cutting board and step away from Jessica. Then you're going to Sit in that chair and wait quietly until the paramedics get here to check on her injuries. Bernard's face darkened with fury, but Frank could see him calculating the odds of success if this confrontation turned physical. At 73, Bernard had at least 40 pounds on Frank, but was clearly out of shape and appeared to have been drinking. Frank, despite being 68, maintained the fitness level of someone who had never stopped thinking of his body as a weapon that might need to be deployed at any moment. More importantly, Frank carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had used violence professionally and was prepared to do so again if necessary. Bernard might be used to intimidating his young wife, but he was smart enough to recognize that Frank Morrison represented a different category of threat entirely. "You don't understand the situation," Bernard said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone as he attempted to regain control through manipulation rather than direct confrontation. "Jessica has problems, mental health issues. Sometimes she hurts herself and then blames me. I was trying to help her when you broke in here." Frank had heard similar explanations from insurgents, who claimed that civilian casualties were the result of enemy action rather than their own violence. The tactics were identical: deny responsibility, blame the victim, and attempt to position the aggressor as the actual victim of misunderstanding or circumstance. "Bernard," Frank said, his patience exhausted by months of watching this escalate toward inevitable tragedy, "put down the cutting board now, or I'm going to take it away from you. And trust me, you don't want me to have to do that." The threat was clear and backed by the kind of presence that only came from years of backing up such statements with action. Bernard looked at Frank's face, at his posture, at the way he held himself ready for instant movement, and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. The cutting board clattered to the kitchen floor as Bernard raised his hands in a gesture of surrender that was probably meant to look cooperative, but came across as the calculated move of someone buying time to plan his next manipulation. "Good choice," Frank said, moving to position himself between Bernard and Jessica while keeping both of them in his sight lines. "Now sit down in that chair and keep your hands where I can see them." As Bernard reluctantly complied, Frank finally allowed himself to look directly at Jessica's condition. What he saw made his jaw clench with the kind of controlled fury that had once made him highly effective at eliminating threats to innocent civilians. Jessica's injuries were extensive and recent. Beyond the head wound and facial swelling Frank had observed through the window, her left wrist showed signs of recent trauma that suggested Bernard had grabbed or twisted it with significant force. Her lip was split and still bleeding slightly, and the way she held her torso indicated possible rib damage from kicks or punches. Most disturbing were her eyes, not just the physical evidence of impact, but the psychological damage that Frank recognized from civilians who had endured extended periods of systematic brutalization. Jessica looked at Frank not with gratitude for his intervention, but with the terrified anticipation of someone who had learned that any change in her circumstances usually made things worse. Frank had entered the Kellerman house to prevent what appeared to be imminent lethal violence. What he had found was evidence of a sustained campaign of brutalization that had been escalating toward exactly the kind of tragedy he had feared. The question now was whether his intervention had come in time to save Jessica Kellerman's life, or whether it had simply delayed Bernard's plans until he could find a more private opportunity to finish what he had started. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the Iowa sky, and in the distance, Frank could hear the sound of approaching sirens. Real ones this time, not the phantom emergency response he had invented to control Bernard's behavior. Frank Morrison stood in his neighbor's kitchen, officially a civilian but operating on combat instincts, watching over a battered woman while containing a predator who had spent months perfecting the art of inflicting suffering. The immediate crisis was under control, but Frank's military experience told him that the most dangerous phase of any operation was often the transition from active engagement to securing the objective. Bernard Kellerman sat in his kitchen chair with the sullen compliance of someone who had been temporarily outmaneuvered but was already planning his next move. And Frank Morrison, veteran of 3 combat deployments and countless life-and-death decisions, had to figure out how to protect Jessica Kellerman, not just from tonight's violence, but from all the nights that would follow. The Cedar Falls Police Department responded with 2 patrol cars and an ambulance, their red and blue lights painting the quiet residential street in alternating colors that drew neighbors to their windows despite the early hour. Frank Morrison watched their approach through the kitchen window while maintaining his position between Bernard and Jessica, calculating how to explain a situation that looked exactly like what it was: an armed veteran who had broken into his neighbor's house. Officer Sarah Chun, no relation to Frank's other neighbors, despite sharing their surname, was the first through the front door after Frank called out that the situation was contained but medical attention was needed. Chun was a 10-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Force, trained in domestic violence response and experienced enough to read a scene quickly and accurately. What she found in the Kellerman kitchen was a tableau that told its story without requiring extensive explanation. An elderly man sitting rigidly in a chair with his hands visible and his face flushed with anger. A young woman on the floor with obvious injuries consistent with physical assault. And Frank Morrison, standing between them with the controlled alertness of someone who had diffused the immediate crisis but remained ready for it to reignite. Frank Morrison, Chun said, recognizing him from previous domestic disturbance calls at this address. Want to tell me what happened here? Frank had rehearsed this moment during the 20 minutes it had taken for emergency services to arrive, knowing that his version of events would need to be both truthful and tactically sound. Military training had included instruction on dealing with civilian law enforcement, particularly in situations where soldiers had been forced to act outside normal chains of command to protect innocent civilians. I heard screaming from next door that indicated someone was in immediate physical danger, Frank said, his voice carrying the factual tone of an after-action report. When I looked through the window, I observed Mr. Kellerman threatening his wife with what appeared to be a weapon while she was injured on the floor. I made entry to prevent what I assessed to be imminent serious bodily harm. Officer Chun nodded, making notes while her partner, Officer Rodriguez, began photographing the scene and checking on Jessica's condition. The kitchen showed clear signs of struggle: overturned chairs, broken dishes on the floor, and droplets of blood that formed a trail from the living room to Jessica's current position against the refrigerator. Mr. Kellerman, Chun said, turning her attention to Bernard, who had remained silent since Frank's explanation began. I need to hear your version of what happened here tonight. Bernard's response was immediate and well-rehearsed, delivered with the righteous indignation of someone whose authority had been questioned by inferior beings. This man broke into my house without permission or provocation. My wife had an accident. She fell down the stairs and hit her head. I was trying to help her when this lunatic came through our window with a gun. Frank had expected this line of defense and was prepared for it. Bernard's explanation was plausible enough to create reasonable doubt about the circumstances, particularly since Frank had indeed entered the house illegally and was carrying a weapon. In domestic violence cases, the victim's reluctance to contradict their abuser often meant that the only witnesses were the perpetrator and any outside observers whose testimony could be dismissed as misinterpretation or interference. Ma'am, Officer Chun said, kneeling beside Jessica with the careful movements of someone trained to interact with trauma victims. Can you tell me what happened tonight? Take your time. Jessica's response would determine whether Frank's intervention was treated as justified protection of a crime victim or unlawful entry into a domestic dispute. Frank watched her face as she processed the question, seeing the internal calculation that every abuse victim had to make: tell the truth and risk worse consequences later, or protect the abuser and enable the violence to continue. Jessica Kellerman looked at her husband, at Frank, at the police officers, and finally at her own hands clasped in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of months of suppressed truth finally. Being released, "He hit me," she said simply. "He's been hitting me for months, but tonight was different. Tonight he said he was going to kill me." The admission seemed to drain the last of Jessica's strength, and she slumped against the refrigerator, as if speaking those words had required all her remaining energy. But the effect on everyone else in the room was immediate and profound. Officer Chen's expression hardened with the professional anger of someone who had seen too many cases where intervention came too late. Officer Rodriguez stopped taking photographs and began reading Bernard his rights while reaching for handcuffs. And Bernard Kellerman's face transformed from righteous indignation to calculating fury as he realized that his primary weapon, Jessica's silence, had been neutralized. "She's lying," Bernard said, his voice rising with desperate intensity. "She has mental problems. She hurts herself and then blames me. Check her medical records. She's been hospitalized for psychiatric issues. She can't be trusted to tell the truth about anything." Frank had heard similar character assassination attempts in military tribunals where war criminals tried to discredit civilian witnesses. The tactics were always the same: attack the victim's credibility, suggest mental instability, and position the perpetrator as the true victim of false accusations. But Officer Chen had also heard these defenses before, and she responded with the kind of practiced skepticism that came from years of investigating domestic violence cases where abusers followed predictable scripts when their control was threatened. "Mr. Kellerman," Chen said firmly, "you're under arrest for domestic assault. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right until you can speak with an attorney." As Officer Rodriguez cuffed Bernard and led him toward the patrol car, the older man's facade of wounded innocence finally cracked completely. He turned back toward Jessica with an expression of pure malevolence that made Frank's hand move instinctively toward his weapon. "This isn't over," Bernard said, his voice carrying the cold promise of someone whose primary concern was regaining control rather than avoiding legal consequences. "You know what happens to people who betray me, Jessica. You know I always finish what I start." The threat was delivered in front of 2 police officers and would undoubtedly be included in their reports, but Frank recognized it for what it was: Bernard's final attempt to maintain psychological control over Jessica, even as his physical control was being removed. The message was clear: legal consequences were temporary, but Bernard's capacity for revenge was permanent. Officer Chen made note of the threat while the paramedics who had arrived with the police began their examination of Jessica's injuries. Their assessment confirmed what Frank had observed: multiple contusions consistent with being struck by fists, possible concussion from head trauma, and defensive wounds on her arms that indicated she had tried to protect herself during the assault. "Ma'am, we need to transport you to the hospital for a complete evaluation," the lead paramedic, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Williams, explained to Jessica. "You may have internal injuries that aren't immediately apparent, and that head wound needs proper treatment." Jessica's response revealed another layer of the systematic control Bernard had exercised over her life. "I don't have insurance," she said quietly. "Bernard handles all the financial matters. I don't even know what coverage we have or how to access it." Frank felt another surge of anger at the completeness of Bernard's dominance over Jessica's life. Financial control was a common tactic among domestic abusers, ensuring that victims couldn't access resources needed to escape or seek help independently. By controlling insurance information, bank accounts, and even basic identification documents, abusers could make their victims dependent on them for survival itself. "The county will cover emergency medical treatment," Officer Chen assured Jessica. "Right now, your health is the priority. Everything else can be sorted out later." As the paramedics prepared Jessica for transport, Frank found himself facing A different kind of tactical decision. His immediate intervention had succeeded in stopping the acute violence and getting Bernard into police custody. But the broader mission ensuring Jessica's long-term safety was far from complete. Frank's military experience had taught him that successful operations required planning beyond the immediate objective. Rescuing Jessica from tonight's assault was only the first phase of a larger campaign to protect her from future retaliation and help her rebuild a life free from Bernard's control. "Officer Chun," Frank said as Jessica was loaded into the ambulance, "I'd like to provide a detailed statement about what I've observed at this address over the past 8 months. I believe tonight's incident was an escalation of an ongoing pattern of abuse that needs to be documented for prosecution purposes." Chun nodded approvingly. "That would be very helpful, Mr. Morrison. Can you come to the station later this morning? We'll want to get everything on record while it's fresh." Frank agreed, but his attention was focused on the ambulance carrying Jessica towards Cedar Falls Regional Hospital. She was physically safe for the moment, but Frank's combat experience had taught him to think in terms of sustainable security rather than temporary victories. Bernard Kellerman would be released on bail within days, possibly hours, when that happened. His primary objective would be regaining control over Jessica through intimidation, manipulation, or direct violence. The legal system moved slowly, and domestic abusers were often skilled at exploiting the gaps between arrest and conviction to eliminate witnesses or pressure victims into recanting their statements. Frank also recognized that his own legal situation remained complicated. He had committed several crimes in the process of helping Jessica, breaking and entering, criminal trespass, and potentially brandishing a weapon, depending on how the prosecutor interpreted his actions. While these charges were unlikely to be pursued given the circumstances, they provided Bernard's attorney with ammunition to discredit Frank's testimony and portray him as a vigilante who had misinterpreted a domestic dispute as the emergency. Vehicles departed, and Maple Street returned to its normal quiet. Frank stood in his driveway, processing the implications of what had just occurred. He had crossed a line that separated concerned neighbor from active participant in Jessica's struggle for survival. There was no going back to passive observation and documentation. Frank Morrison had spent 30 years serving his country by protecting the innocent from those who would harm them. Tonight, he had discovered that retirement didn't mean the end of that mission. It just meant the battlefield had moved to suburban Iowa. The sun was fully up now, painting the cornfields around Cedar Falls in the golden light of a new day. Frank's neighbors were beginning their morning routines, probably wondering about the commotion that had disrupted their sleep, but already moving on to more immediate concerns. Only Frank knew that this was not the end of the crisis, but the beginning of a more complex phase that would test his ability to protect Jessica Kellerman, not just from immediate violence, but from a system that often failed to recognize the sophistication of psychological warfare waged by domestic abusers. Bernard Kellerman was in custody for now, but he was also a 73-year-old man with no prior criminal record, who could afford good legal representation and who had spent months crafting a narrative that portrayed Jessica as mentally unstable and himself as her patient caregiver. Frank Morrison, meanwhile, was a combat veteran with PTSD who had broken into his neighbor's house and threatened an elderly man with a weapon. On paper, it wasn't clear who would emerge from the legal proceedings as victim and who as perpetrator. For Jessica Kellerman's life was just beginning, and Frank Morrison was no longer watching from the sidelines. Frank Morrison spent the next 6 hours learning why domestic violence victims often chose to stay with their abusers, rather than navigate the labyrinth of legal and social services that were supposedly designed to protect them. What should have been a straightforward process of documenting abuse and ensuring victim safety instead became a masterclass in institutional failure and systemic inadequacy. His first stop was Cedar Falls Regional Hospital, where Jessica had been admitted for Observation following her concussion and other injuries. Frank arrived at 10 a.m., expecting to find her receiving comprehensive care and planning for her safe transition away from Bernard's house. Instead, he found her sitting alone in a generic hospital room, still wearing a patient gown and staring out the window with the hollow expression of someone who had learned not to hope for better outcomes. "They want to discharge me this afternoon," Jessica said when Frank knocked on her doorframe. Her voice carried a flatness that Frank recognized from soldiers who had been pushed beyond their psychological breaking point. "The doctor says my injuries aren't severe enough to justify extended hospitalization, and the social worker says there's a bed available at the women's shelter if I want it." Frank pulled a chair closer to Jessica's bed, noting the way she unconsciously flinched when he moved quickly. 8 months of systematic brutalization had taught her to expect violence from any sudden movement, even from someone who had risked his own safety to protect her. "What do you want to do?" Frank asked, though he suspected the question itself revealed his inexperience with domestic violence situations. Jessica had been conditioned to survive by anticipating and accommodating Bernard's wants, not by developing or expressing preferences of her own. "I don't know," Jessica admitted, her honesty more devastating than any dramatic declaration of independence might have been. "I've never lived anywhere by myself. I married Bernard straight from my father's house, and before that I lived in group homes. I don't know how to open a bank account or get a job or even apply for an apartment. Bernard handled everything." The scope of Jessica's learned helplessness became clearer as they talked. She had no driver's license. Bernard had always driven her wherever she needed to go. She had no credit history in her own name. All accounts were in Bernard's name with her, listed only as an authorized user. She had no work experience. Bernard had insisted that her role was maintaining their home and supporting his retirement activities. Most critically, she had no social support network. Bernard had systematically isolated her from potential friends, discouraging relationships with neighbors, co-workers, or anyone who might notice signs of abuse or offer alternative perspectives on their marriage. The few family members who had maintained contact had been gradually alienated through Bernard's campaign of portraying Jessica as mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. Frank's military training had included instruction on identifying and exploiting enemy vulnerabilities, but it had also taught him to recognize the psychological tactics used to break down resistance and create dependence. What Bernard had done to Jessica over 18 months of marriage was indistinguishable from the techniques used by hostile forces to control prisoners of war. "The shelter social worker wants to meet with me at 2 o'clock, Jessica continued. "She's going to explain their program and help me understand my options. But Bernard will be released on bail sometime today, and he'll know I'm there. Everyone knows where the women's shelter is located." Frank had already researched this issue during his morning at the police station. Cedar Falls, like many small cities, had exactly one domestic violence shelter, housed in a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street that was marked with discreet signage but known to anyone who had lived in the area for more than a few months. The shelter provided essential services, temporary housing, counseling, legal advocacy, but it couldn't provide anonymity in a town where everyone recognized each other at the grocery store. "What did your lawyer say about the situation?" Frank asked, then immediately realized his mistake when Jessica's expression shifted to confusion. "I don't have a lawyer," she said. "I wouldn't know how to find one or pay for one. The police gave me a phone number for the victim's advocate, but she won't be able to meet with me until tomorrow morning." Frank felt his jaw clench with frustration at the gap between what Jessica needed and what the system was prepared to provide. In military operations, protecting high-value assets from enemy retaliation required immediate relocation, secure communications, and 24/7 security until the threat was neutralized. In civilian domestic violence cases, victims were expected to navigate complex bureaucracies while their abusers remained free and motivated to eliminate the primary witnesses against them. "Jessica," Frank said carefully, "what if there was another option? Something that might buy us time to get you properly set up with legal representation and secure housing." She looked at him with the wary attention of someone who had learned to distrust offers of help that came with hidden costs or unexpected consequences. What kind of option? Frank had been developing this idea since watching the ambulance carry Jessica away from Maple Street, refining it during his statement to the police and his morning research into Iowa's domestic violence laws. It was unorthodox and potentially problematic, but his military experience had taught him that unconventional tactics were sometimes necessary when conventional approaches were inadequate to the threat level. "My house has a guest room that's been empty since my wife died," Frank said. "It's private, secure, and Bernard doesn't have any legal right to enter my property. You could stay there while we work on getting you established independently long enough to open your own bank account, get identification documents, and find legal representation that can protect you long term." Jessica stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through surprise, hope, suspicion, and something that might have been the first stirring of genuine gratitude she had felt in months. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." Frank considered several possible answers: that he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent person be victimized, that his military training had prepared him to protect civilians from hostile forces, that Helen would have expected him to help someone in Jessica's situation. All of these were true, but they weren't the complete truth. "Because I've been where you are," Frank said finally. "Not with domestic violence, but with feeling like the world had ended and there was no point in trying to rebuild. After my wife died, I spent months convinced that nothing I did mattered anymore, that I was just taking up space until it was time to join her." He paused, remembering the morning when Jessica's screams had interrupted his planned suicide. The way her crisis had given him a purpose beyond his own grief. "Helping you helps me too. It gives me something worth doing with whatever time I have left." The honesty seemed to reach Jessica in a way that generic offers of assistance might not have. Frank could see her calculating the risks and benefits of his proposal, weighing the unknown dangers of trusting a relative stranger against the known certainty that returning to Bernard's house would eventually result in her death. "What about Bernard?" she asked. "He'll be furious if he finds out I'm staying with you. He might try to hurt you too." Frank almost smiled at the concern in her voice, the automatic impulse to protect others even when she had been the primary victim of violence. "Jessica, I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq dealing with people who were actively trying to kill me. Bernard Kellerman doesn't scare me." What Frank didn't say was that Bernard represented a different kind of threat than enemy combatants in war zones. Combat opponents followed certain rules. They wanted to win battles and survive conflicts. Bernard's primary motivation was maintaining control over Jessica and people fighting for psychological dominance. Rather than tactical advantage, were often willing to accept higher costs and take greater risks. Knock on the door interrupted their conversation as Dr. Patricia Manning, the emergency physician who had treated Jessica's injuries, entered with a clipboard and the brisk efficiency of someone managing multiple critical patients. "Miss Kellerman," Dr. Manning said, "your CT scan came back clear and your other injuries are healing well. We're ready to discharge you whenever you're comfortable with your transition plan." Frank stood to introduce himself, recognizing an opportunity to gain a medical professional's perspective on Jessica's situation. "Doctor, I'm Frank Morrison, Jessica's neighbor. I was wondering if you could help us understand the long-term implications of her injuries, particularly any ongoing risks we should monitor." Dr. Manning's expression shifted as she processed Frank's involvement in Jessica's care. "Are you family? I need to be careful about patient confidentiality. He's the one who saved my life," Jessica said quietly. "I want him to know what you think about my condition." Dr. Manning nodded and consulted her chart. The physical injuries will heal completely within a few weeks. The concussion was mild, and there's no evidence of intracranial bleeding or permanent brain injury. However, I'm more concerned about the psychological trauma, particularly given what appears to be an extended pattern of abuse. She paused, choosing her words carefully. In my experience, victims of domestic violence face the highest risk of serious injury or death when they first attempt to leave their abusers. The period immediately following disclosure or escape is when perpetrators are most likely to escalate to lethal violence. Frank felt a chill at the clinical confirmation of what his tactical instincts had already suggested. Bernard's threats during his arrest hadn't been empty bluster. They represented the predictable response of someone whose primary asset, control over Jessica, had been compromised and needed to be reestablished or eliminated. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" Frank asked. "The statistics suggest that the first 72 hours are critical," Dr. Manning replied. "If the victim can remain safe and separate during that initial period, the risk decreases significantly as the perpetrator begins to focus on legal defense rather than retaliation." Frank checked his watch and did the calculation. Jessica had been hospitalized for roughly 12 hours since Bernard's arrest. That left them with approximately 60 hours to establish secure housing, legal protection, and support services before the window of highest danger began to close. "Doctor," Frank said, "what would you recommend as the safest course of action for Jessica right now?" Dr. Manning looked between Frank and Jessica, clearly weighing professional caution against the reality of limited options available to domestic violence victims in small communities. Ideally, she would be relocated to a secure facility outside the immediate area until her abuser is convicted and incarcerated. Realistically, that kind of resource doesn't exist for most victims. She handed Jessica a folder containing discharge instructions and resource information. "The important thing is that you don't go anywhere he can predict you'll be. Don't follow your normal routines. Don't go to places you've been before. And don't trust anyone who might report your location back to him." As Dr. Manning left to process Jessica's discharge, Frank found himself thinking about the tactical principles that had kept his unit alive during urban combat operations in hostile territory. The key to surviving when enemy forces were actively hunting you was unpredictability, varying routes, changing safe houses, avoiding patterns that could be exploited by adversaries who knew your habits and preferences. Bernard Kellerman had spent 18 months learning Jessica's routines, fears, and vulnerabilities. He knew how she thought, how she made decisions, and what kinds of pressure were most effective at controlling her behavior. Protecting her from his retaliation would require breaking every pattern he had conditioned her to follow and replacing them with new ones designed around security rather than compliance. Frank Morrison had volunteered for one of the most dangerous missions of his civilian life, protecting a domestic violence victim from an abuser who had every incentive to silence her permanently and nothing left to lose in the attempt. The next 60 hours would determine whether Frank's military training was sufficient preparation for a war fought not in foreign deserts, but in the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa, where the enemy looked like a respectable retired insurance adjuster and the battlefield was everywhere Jessica might seek safety. Bernard Kellerman was released on bail at 3:47 p.m., exactly 18 hours and 12 minutes after his arrest. Frank Morrison knew this because he had positioned himself in the parking lot across from the Lynn County Courthouse with a clear view of the bail bondsman's office and the tactical patience of someone who had spent months conducting surveillance operations in hostile territory. Frank's military training had taught him that intelligence was the foundation of successful protection operations. You couldn't defend against threats you couldn't anticipate, and you couldn't anticipate threats without understanding your adversary's capabilities, motivations, and likely courses of action. Bernard Kellerman represented a new kind of enemy, one who understood the legal system's vulnerabilities and knew how to exploit them for strategic advantage. Bernard emerged from the courthouse looking nothing like the enraged domestic abuser Frank had confronted in the kitchen 12 hours earlier. He wore a crisp navy suit that suggested respectability and financial resources, walked with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his problems solved by competent professionals, and carried himself like a man who had just experienced a minor inconvenience rather than a criminal arrest. More concerning was Bernard's first stop after leaving the courthouse. Instead of returning home or meeting with his attorney, he drove directly to Cedar Falls Regional Hospital, parking in the visitor lot and walking toward the main entrance with the purposeful stride of someone executing a planned mission. Frank followed at a distance, using the tactical movement techniques that had kept him alive during urban operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Bernard wasn't just checking on Jessica's medical condition, he was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about her current status and location that could be used for future operations. The hospital's information desk presented Bernard with his first operational challenge. Patient privacy laws prevented staff from confirming whether Jessica was still admitted or providing details about her condition without her explicit consent. But Bernard had spent decades working in insurance investigations, and he understood how to extract information from institutional bureaucracies that were designed to restrict access. Frank watched from the hospital cafeteria as Bernard engaged the volunteer at the information desk with the friendly persistence of someone accustomed to getting cooperation through a combination of authority and charm. Within 10 minutes, Bernard had learned that Jessica had been discharged that afternoon, that she had left with a male companion who matched Frank's description, and that she had declined to provide a forwarding address for follow-up care. Bernard's reaction to this intelligence was subtle but telling. His posture straightened slightly, his jaw tightened with controlled anger, and his eyes took on the focused intensity of a predator who had just identified both his prey and the obstacle, protecting it. Frank recognized the expression from enemy combatants who had shifted from defensive to offensive operations, accepting higher risks in pursuit of decisive victory. Frank's cell phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica, who was currently settling into his guest room under the protection of his home security system and the loaded Sig Sauer P226 he kept within arm's reach. "Everything okay there? I'm worried about you being out alone." The message revealed both Jessica's growing trust in Frank's protection and her continued fear that Bernard's reach extended beyond legal constraints. She understood better than anyone that her husband's apparent compliance with bail conditions was tactical theater designed to maintain his freedom of movement while he planned more direct action. Frank typed back quickly, "BK released. Currently at hospital gathering intel. Will be home soon. Keep doors locked and stay away from windows." Bernard's next stop confirmed Frank's assessment of the threat level. Instead of returning to his house on Maple Street, Bernard drove to a strip mall on the outskirts of Cedar Falls and parked outside a small storefront with no visible signage. Frank recognized the location from his earlier research into local private investigation services. Bernard was hiring professional help to locate Jessica and monitor Frank's activities. Frank's military experience had included extensive training in counter-surveillance techniques, but civilian private investigators operated under different constraints and with different capabilities than enemy intelligence services. They couldn't legally enter private property or use electronic surveillance without proper authorization, but they could conduct extensive background research, establish monitoring positions in public areas, and employ technological resources that might not be available to individual abusers. The fact that Bernard was investing in professional assistance rather than attempting direct confrontation suggested both financial resources and strategic thinking that elevated him above the typical domestic violence perpetrator. He was treating Jessica's escape as a complex problem requiring comprehensive solutions, rather than an emotional crisis to be resolved through immediate violence. Frank documented Bernard's activities with the careful precision he had used for intelligence reports in combat zones, noting times, locations, and observed behaviors that might predict future actions. By 6 p.m., he had compiled enough information to understand that Bernard's immediate strategy focused on surveillance and intelligence gathering rather than direct assault. This was both good news and bad news for Jessica's security. The good news was that Bernard wasn't planning to kick down Frank's door in a fit of rage. He was taking time to plan more sophisticated operations that might be more successful, but would also take longer to develop. The bad news was that Bernard's approach suggested patience, resources, and strategic thinking that would make him a more dangerous long-term adversary. Frank returned to his house as the sun was setting over the Iowa cornfields, painting the sky in the same golden colors that had witnessed his suicidal walk to the oak tree just 3 days earlier. The timing felt symbolic. His life had been measured in hours then, but now he was planning operations that extended weeks into the future, anchored by the responsibility of protecting someone who had become more important to him than his own survival. Jessica met him at the door with an expression that mixed relief and anxiety in equal measure. She had changed from her hospital gown into clothes that Frank's neighbor Dorothy Chun had brought over, jeans and a sweater that actually fit properly. The first clothing Jessica had worn in months that hadn't been selected and approved by Bernard for its adherence to his standards of appropriate appearance. "How bad is it?" Jessica asked as Frank secured the door locks and activated his home security system. Frank had debated how much tactical information to share with Jessica, weighing her need to understand the threat against the risk of overwhelming her with details that might increase her anxiety without improving her safety. His military experience suggested that civilians under protection usually function better when they understood their situation clearly rather than being kept in the dark about dangers they couldn't control. "He's taking this seriously," Frank said, settling into his living room chair while Jessica curled up on the couch with the defensive posture of someone who had learned to make herself smaller when threats were discussed. "He's not acting like someone who expects this to blow over or be resolved through the legal system. He's planning something more comprehensive." Jessica nodded with the grim understanding of someone who had lived with Bernard's strategic thinking for 18 months. He always said that people who crossed him learned to regret it. He used to tell stories about insurance fraud cases where he had to investigate people who thought they were smarter than the system. "What kind of stories?" Frank asked, recognizing that Bernard's professional background might provide insights into his current operational planning. "Cases where he caught people lying about disability claims or accident injuries," Jessica said. He was proud of how he could gather evidence that proved people were faking their conditions. He would follow them around for weeks, documenting everything they did, building cases that their lawyers couldn't challenge. Frank felt a chill of recognition as he understood the implications of Jessica's revelation. Bernard had spent his career conducting exactly the kind of surveillance and documentation operations that would be most effective against domestic violence victims trying to establish new lives. He knew how to investigate financial records, employment history, and social connections. He understood legal procedures and evidence requirements. Most importantly, he had experience turning people's own behavior against them in official proceedings. "Jessica," Frank said carefully, "did Bernard ever mention having contacts in law enforcement or social services? People who might provide information or assistance with his investigations?" Jessica's expression darkened as she processed the question and its implications. He used to brag about having friends everywhere. Police officers who helped with difficult cases, social workers who understood that some people couldn't be trusted to tell the truth, judges who appreciated thorough investigations. The scope of Bernard's potential network was becoming clearer, and it explained why he had approached his current situation with confidence rather than desperation. If Bernard had cultivated relationships with people throughout the local criminal justice system, he might have access to information about Jessica's location, Frank's background, and the progress of legal proceedings that could give him significant tactical advantages. Frank's phone rang, with a call from Officer Sarah Chun, who had investigated the domestic violence incident and taken Bernard into custody. Frank answered, on speakerphone so Jessica could hear the conversation directly. Mr. Morrison, Chun said, her voice carrying professional concern. I wanted to update you on some developments in the Kellerman case. Mr. Kellerman's attorney has filed a motion, claiming that his client is the victim of a vendetta by a mentally unstable neighbor with PTSD. They're arguing that you misinterpreted a domestic dispute and used excessive force based on combat-related paranoia. Frank had expected this line of legal defense, but hearing it articulated by law enforcement made its potential effectiveness more real. Bernard's attorney was using Frank's military service and mental health history as weapons against both his credibility and his freedom. There's more, Chun continued. They've also filed a restraining order request against you, claiming that you pose a continuing threat to their client's safety and property. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Frank felt the tactical situation shifting as Bernard's counteroffensive began in earnest. Instead of simply defending against domestic violence charges, Bernard was attempting to reframe the entire incident as a case of vigilante violence by an unstable veteran against an innocent elderly man. If successful, the strategy would not only discredit Frank's testimony, but potentially result in his own arrest and imprisonment. Officer Chun, Frank said, what evidence are they presenting to support these claims? I can't discuss details of ongoing legal proceedings, Chun replied, but I can tell you that they seem to have done extensive research into your military records and psychiatric treatment history. Their motion includes references to specific deployments and medical evaluations that suggest access to information that should be confidential. Frank exchanged glances with Jessica, both of them understanding that Bernard's intelligence-gathering operations had already begun producing results. Somehow, Bernard or his associates had obtained access to Frank's military and medical records within hours of his release from custody. Officer Chun, Jessica said, speaking for the first time during the call, what happens if they get the restraining order approved? It would legally prohibit Mr. Morrison from coming within 500 feet of Mr. Kellerman's residence or person, Chun explained. Violation of a restraining order is a criminal offense that could result in immediate arrest. The implications were immediately clear to both Frank and Jessica. If Bernard succeeded in getting a restraining order approved, Frank would be legally prohibited from providing Jessica with protection at the very moment when she was most vulnerable to retaliation. Bernard would have used the legal system itself as a weapon to isolate his victim and neutralize her primary defender, Frank. Morrison had spent 3 decades fighting enemies who used conventional military tactics in straightforward combat situations. Bernard Kellerman was proving to be a different kind of adversary, entirely one who understood that the most effective battles were fought in courtrooms and administrative offices rather than on physical battlefields. The war for Jessica's life was entering a new phase, and Frank was beginning to understand that his military training might not be sufficient preparation for an enemy who wielded legal procedures and institutional influence with the same precision that Frank had once applied to weapons and tactics. Tomorrow's court hearing would determine whether Frank Morrison remained Jessica's protector or became another obstacle she would have to overcome in her struggle for survival. The Lynn County Courthouse at 8:30 a.m. was a battlefield Frank Morrison had never trained for. Instead of desert camouflage and tactical gear, he wore his only suit, the navy blue one Helen had bought him for their nephew's wedding 3 years ago. Instead of carrying weapons and communication equipment, he held a manila folder containing character references from his former commanding officers, and medical records that he hoped would counter Bernard's narrative of an unstable veteran prone to violent episodes. Frank's attorney, Margaret Liu, was a 45-year-old former military JAG officer who specialized in defending veterans accused of crimes related to their service. Frank had found her through the Veterans Administration's Legal Assistance Program, and she had agreed to represent him pro bono after reviewing the circumstances of his intervention on Jessica's behalf. "Remember," Liu said as they walked through the courthouse metal detectors, "our objective today isn't to win a comprehensive victory. It's to prevent the restraining order and maintain your freedom to protect Jessica until we can build a stronger case." Frank nodded, but his attention was focused on Bernard Kellerman, who sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, Harold Brennan, a well-dressed man in his 60s whose expensive suit and confident demeanor suggested extensive experience with high-stakes litigation. Bernard had transformed himself once again, this time into the perfect image of a vulnerable elderly victim: slightly stooped posture, nervous glances toward Frank, and the kind of subtle trembling that could be interpreted as fear of potential violence. The performance was masterful, and Frank recognized it as the product of professional coaching. Bernard wasn't just playing a role, he was executing a carefully planned operation designed to manipulate the legal system's biases in favor of elderly victims and against military personnel with mental health histories. Judge Patricia Valdez called the hearing to order with the crisp efficiency of someone who had presided over hundreds of domestic disputes and protection order requests. She was a 20-year veteran of the bench with a reputation for thorough analysis and skepticism toward both genuine victims and manipulative litigants. "Mr. Brennan," Judge Valdez said, addressing Bernard's attorney, "please present your client's petition for a protection order against Mr. Morrison." Harold Brennan stood with theatrical gravity, holding a thick folder that suggested extensive documentation. "Your Honor, my client, Bernard Kellerman, is a 73-year-old retired insurance adjuster who has become the target of escalating harassment and violence from his neighbor, Frank Morrison, a combat veteran suffering from documented post-traumatic stress disorder." Frank felt his jaw clench as Brennan began weaving a narrative that transformed the previous night's events into a story of unprovoked aggression by a mentally unstable veteran against an innocent elderly man. According to Brennan's version, Bernard had been attempting to provide medical assistance to his accident-prone wife when Frank had broken into their home with a weapon and threatened to kill him. Mr. Morrison's military records, which we have obtained through proper legal channels, document multiple deployments to combat zones and subsequent treatment for PTSD, including episodes of hypervigilance, paranoid ideation, and difficulty distinguishing between combat situations and civilian circumstances. Brennan continued. Margaret Liu made notes while Bernard's attorney systematically dismantled Frank's credibility, using his military service and mental health treatment as evidence of his unsuitability for civilian life. Frank had seen similar tactics used against veterans in other legal proceedings, but experiencing it personally felt like watching his decades of honorable service being weaponized against him. "Furthermore," Brennan said, consulting his notes with practiced precision, "Mr. Morrison has exhibited signs of unhealthy obsession with my client's marriage, conducting surveillance of their property, making unfounded reports to law enforcement, and ultimately resorting to criminal behavior when his harassment failed to achieve his objectives." Frank realized that Bernard's team had done extensive research into his previous calls to police about domestic disturbances at the Kellerman residence. What Frank had considered appropriate intervention was being reframed as evidence of obsessive behavior that had escalated to criminal violence. Judge Valdez listened without interruption until Brennan finished his presentation, then turned to Margaret Liu. "Ms. Liu, how does your client respond to these allegations?" Liu stood with the composed confidence of someone who had defended numerous veterans against similar attacks. "Your Honor," Mr. Morrison's actions were entirely consistent with those of a concerned neighbor responding to an obvious emergency situation. Far from being the product of mental instability, his intervention followed appropriate protocols for civilian protection and resulted in the discovery of serious domestic violence that had been concealed from authorities. She opened her own folder and began presenting a different narrative, one in which Frank's military training had enabled him to recognize and respond to a genuine crisis that civilian observers might have missed or ignored. Instead of paranoid hypervigilance, Liu characterized Frank's behavior as the appropriate application of skills developed during decades of protecting innocent civilians in combat zones. The medical evidence clearly shows that Jessica Kellerman sustained injuries consistent with physical assault, Liu continued. The responding officers documented signs of struggle in the Kellerman residence. Most importantly, Mrs. Kellerman herself confirmed that she was the victim of ongoing domestic violence and that Mr. Morrison's intervention prevented what she believed would have been a lethal assault. Frank watched Judge Valdez's expression as she processed these competing narratives, trying to read her assessment of the evidence and arguments being presented. The judge's face remained neutral, but Frank could see her making notes and occasionally glancing between him and Bernard with the analytical attention of someone weighing complex and contradictory evidence. Harold Brennan stood for rebuttal, his tone taking on the patient condescension of someone explaining obvious facts to people who had somehow missed them. Your Honor, Mrs. Kellerman's statement must be understood in the context of her documented mental health issues and her obvious intimidation by Mr. Morrison's violent intervention. She was traumatized by having an armed stranger break into her home and threaten her husband, and her subsequent statements reflect that trauma rather than accurate recollection of events. Frank felt a surge of anger at this characterization of Jessica's courage in finally speaking the truth about her abuse. But Lou had warned him that any visible emotional reaction would be used as evidence of the instability Bernard's team was trying to establish. Furthermore, Brennan continued, we have documented evidence that Mr. Morrison has inserted himself into Mrs. Kellerman's life in ways that suggest inappropriate personal interest rather than genuine concern for her welfare. He has offered her housing in his own residence, isolated her from family and professional support networks, and positioned himself as her sole source of protection and assistance. Frank realized with growing alarm that Bernard's intelligence gathering operations had produced accurate information about Jessica's current living situation. Somehow, Bernard knew that Jessica was staying at Frank's house, and his attorney was using this information to suggest that Frank's motivations were predatory rather than protective. Judge Valdez called for a brief recess to review the documentation submitted by both sides, leaving Frank and Lou to confer in the hallway while Bernard and his attorney continued their strategy session. They're better prepared than I expected, Lou admitted quietly. Someone has done extensive research into your background and Jessica's situation. Do you have any idea how they obtained access to your military medical records? Frank had been wondering the same thing since Officer Chun's phone call the previous evening. His psychiatric treatment records were protected by federal privacy laws that should have prevented civilian attorneys from accessing them without court orders or his specific consent. It's possible they have contacts within the Veterans Administration or Department of Defense, Frank said. Bernard spent his career investigating insurance fraud, which means he developed relationships with people who had access to confidential information. Lou nodded grimly. That would explain how they obtained records that should have been protected. It also suggests that this isn't a typical domestic violence case. Bernard has resources and connections that most abusers don't possess. When the hearing resumed, Judge Valdez announced her decision with the careful phrasing of someone who understood that both parties would scrutinize every word for grounds for appeal. After reviewing the evidence presented by both parties, I find that there are legitimate concerns about the events of November 15th that require further investigation," she said. However, the evidence does not support the issuance of a blanket protection order against Mr. Morrison. Frank felt relief beginning to build, but Judge Valdez wasn't finished. "That said, I am issuing a limited restraining order that prohibits Mr. Morrison from entering or approaching within 100 feet of the Kellerman residence at 324 Maple Street. This order will remain in effect until the criminal charges against Mr. Kellerman are resolved or until further order of this court." The partial victory felt hollow as Frank processed its implications. He could continue providing Jessica with shelter and protection, but he was legally prohibited from securing his own property line or investigating activities at Bernard's house that might threaten Jessica's safety. More troubling was Judge Valdez's final statement. "I am also ordering both parties to undergo psychological evaluation by court-appointed mental health professionals. These evaluations will inform any future decisions regarding protection orders or modifications to the current restrictions." Frank understood immediately that this psychological evaluation would become another battlefield in Bernard's campaign to discredit him. Court-appointed evaluators would have access to his complete military medical history, and Bernard's attorney would undoubtedly argue that any diagnosis of PTSD rendered Frank unfit to provide protection for domestic violence victims. As they left the courthouse, Frank realized that Bernard's legal strategy was more sophisticated than simple character assassination. By forcing Frank to undergo psychological evaluation while simultaneously portraying Jessica as mentally unstable, Bernard was attempting to establish a narrative in which both potential witnesses against him lacked credibility due to mental health issues. "What's our next move?" Frank asked Lou as they reached the parking lot. "We prepare for the psychological evaluation and hope that the evaluator understands the difference between combat-related PTSD and the kind of mental instability that would make you dangerous to civilians," Lou replied. "Meanwhile, we need to document everything that happens over the next few weeks. Bernard isn't going to stop with today's hearing." Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. "Saw news van outside the house. Reporter asking neighbors about domestic violence incident. Someone leaked information to media." Frank showed the message to Liu, who swore quietly under her breath. "Bernard's escalating to public pressure. If he can turn this into a media story about a dangerous veteran terrorizing an elderly couple, it becomes much harder for Jessica to maintain her credibility as a victim." Frank Morrison had survived 3 combat deployments and countless life-threatening situations, but he had never faced an enemy who understood how to weaponize institutions, media coverage, and public opinion against their opponents. Bernard Kellerman was proving to be a more sophisticated adversary than any foreign combatant Frank had encountered. The battle for Jessica's safety was expanding beyond the courthouse and police station into territory that Frank had never learned to navigate. Bernard was fighting a comprehensive campaign designed not just to discredit Frank's testimony, but to destroy his reputation, freedom, and ability to function in civilian society. Frank Morrison was learning that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who understood that true warfare wasn't conducted with weapons, but with lawyers, journalists, and the careful manipulation of systems designed to protect the innocent. The Channel 7 news van parked outside Frank's house at 6 p.m. was just the beginning. By 8 p.m., 3 more news vehicles had arrived on Maple Street, their satellite dishes and camera equipment, transforming the quiet residential neighborhood into a media circus that drew curious onlookers and turned Frank's front yard into a battleground for public opinion. Frank watched the scene unfold from his living room window while Jessica remained hidden in the guest bedroom, both of them understanding that her appearance would provide exactly the kind of dramatic footage that television producers craved. The story was already being framed in ways that would make Jessica's safety secondary to entertainment value and ratings considerations. This is Amanda Rodriguez reporting live from Cedar Falls, where a domestic dispute has escalated into questions about whether combat veterans suffering from PTSD should be allowed to own firearms. The Channel 7 reporter announced to her camera crew, standing directly in front of Frank's house in a way that suggested he was the primary subject of investigation rather than the person who had prevented a potential homicide. Frank's phone had been ringing constantly since the news crews arrived, with calls from reporters requesting interviews, neighbors asking what was happening, and strangers who had somehow obtained his number offering opinions about his military service, mental health, and right to own weapons. He had stopped answering after the fifth call from someone claiming to represent a veterans advocacy organization that wanted to use his case to promote legislation restricting gun ownership for soldiers with PTSD diagnoses. "Frank," Jessica called from the guest room, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's someone at the back door." Frank moved through his house with tactical caution, checking sight lines and potential escape routes out of habit developed during urban combat operations. The back door revealed Dorothy Chen, his elderly neighbor, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the determined expression of someone who had decided to ignore media chaos in favor of more practical concerns. "I brought dinner," Dorothy announced as Frank opened the door, stepping inside with the brisk efficiency of a retired teacher accustomed to managing chaotic situations. "Robert and I figured you and Jessica might not be able to get to the grocery store with all this nonsense happening outside." Frank felt a surge of gratitude for Dorothy's simple kindness, which cut through the media hysteria with practical neighborly support. "Mrs. Chen, you didn't need to." "Of course I did," Dorothy interrupted, heading toward the kitchen with her casserole. "That poor girl has been through enough without having to worry about where her next meal is coming from. And those reporters can camp out there all week for all I care. They're not getting any information from Robert or me." Jessica emerged from the guest room cautiously, still wearing the borrowed clothes that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her 34 years. Dorothy took one look at Jessica's healing injuries and the way she held herself defensively, and immediately shifted into the protective mode that had served her through 40 years of teaching middle school students. "Sit down, dear," Dorothy said, guiding Jessica to the kitchen table. "You look like you haven't been eating properly. Has that monster been controlling your food too?" The question revealed Dorothy's intuitive understanding of how domestic abuse worked not just through physical violence, but through systematic control of every aspect of the victim's life. Jessica nodded silently, apparently unable to articulate the extent of Bernard's domination over her basic needs. "My late sister went through something similar with her first husband," Dorothy continued matter-of-factly while serving portions of what smelled like homemade chicken and rice casserole. "Took her 3 tries to get away from him permanently. The important thing is that you got out alive, and now you have people who won't let him hurt you again." Frank watched Jessica's reaction to Dorothy's matter-of-fact acceptance of her situation, seeing some of the tension leave her shoulders as she encountered someone who understood domestic violence as a common tragedy rather than an exotic crisis requiring extensive explanation. "Mrs. Chen," Frank said, "what are the neighbors saying about all this media attention?" Dorothy's expression hardened with the disapproval of someone who had spent decades dealing with parents who believed gossip and rumors over documented facts. "Most people are keeping their opinions to themselves until they know what really happened. But a few of the busybodies are already spreading stories about how you've always been strange and antisocial since your wife died." Frank had expected this kind of neighborhood speculation, but hearing it confirmed still stung. The same isolation that had protected his grief from public scrutiny was now being used as evidence of his unfitness for civilian life. "There's also talk about how Bernard has been telling people for months that Jessica has mental problems and that he's been trying to get her proper treatment," Dorothy continued. "He apparently convinced several people that you've been harassing them because you're obsessed with their marriage." The scope of Bernard's preparation became clearer as Frank realized that the media narrative wasn't spontaneous, but had been carefully constructed over months of strategic groundwork. Bernard had been positioning himself as a patient caregiver, dealing with an unstable wife and a dangerous neighbor long before the actual confrontation occurred. Frank's landline phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed a number he recognized. His former commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson, who had served as Frank's mentor during his final deployment and had maintained occasional contact during Frank's transition to civilian life. "Frank," Patterson said when Frank answered, "I've been watching the news coverage of your situation. I wanted you to know that several of us are prepared to provide character testimony if this goes to trial." Frank felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment that his personal crisis was requiring intervention from military colleagues who had their own responsibilities and careers to protect. "Colonel, I appreciate the support, but I don't want to drag you into this mess." "Son," Patterson replied with the firm tone that had made him an effective leader of soldiers in combat situations, "you spent 15 years serving your country with distinction. The idea that your PTSD diagnosis makes you unfit to protect innocent civilians is not only wrong, it's dangerous precedent that affects every veteran who's ever sought treatment for combat-related stress." Patterson's perspective helped Frank understand that his case had implications beyond Jessica's immediate safety. If Bernard succeeded in using Frank's military mental health history to discredit him, it would establish a legal precedent that could be used against other veterans in similar situations. "I've been in contact with several veterans organizations," Patterson continued. "They're prepared to provide legal and public relations support to counter the narrative that's being constructed against you. But we need to move quickly before public opinion solidifies around the idea that you're a dangerous veteran who should never have been allowed to own weapons." Frank looked at Jessica, who was listening to his side of the conversation with growing concern. She understood better than anyone that the media attention was transforming her personal trauma into a public spectacle that would be resolved based on political considerations rather than the facts of her abuse. "Colonel," Frank said, "what kind of support are we talking about?" "Media interviews with veterans who've served with you, expert testimony about the difference between PTSD symptoms and violent instability, and political pressure on local officials to focus on the domestic violence charges against Bernard rather than the mental health status of the person who stopped him." The offer was generous and potentially effective, but Frank hesitated to accept it. Military intervention in civilian legal proceedings carried risks for everyone involved, and he didn't want to transform Jessica's situation into a political battle about veterans' rights that might overshadow her need for protection and justice. A knock at the front door interrupted Frank's conversation with Patterson. Through the window, Frank could see a well-dressed woman in her 50s, holding a briefcase and standing with the confident posture of someone accustomed to gaining access to places where others might be refused entry. "Mr. Morrison," the woman called through the door, "my name is Linda Martinez. I'm an investigative journalist with the Des Moines Register. I'd like to discuss some information I've uncovered about Bernard Kellerman's background that might be relevant to your situation." Frank exchanged glances with Jessica, both of them understanding that this represented either an opportunity for favorable coverage or another trap designed to gather information that could be used against them. "I'll call you back, Colonel," Frank said to Patterson, then moved to the front door while signaling Jessica to remain out of sight. "Ms. Martinez," Frank said through the closed door, "this isn't a good time for interviews." "Mr. Morrison, I understand your reluctance to speak with media," Martinez replied, "but I think you should know that Bernard Kellerman has a history that contradicts the image he's presenting to the court and the public. I've found evidence of previous domestic violence allegations that were mysteriously dropped, and financial irregularities in his insurance investigation business that suggest connections to people with significant influence in local law enforcement." Frank felt his pulse quicken as he processed this information. If Martinez had uncovered evidence of Bernard's previous pattern of abuse or corruption, it could fundamentally change the legal and public relations dynamics of their situation. "What kind of evidence?" Frank asked through the door. "Police reports from Chicago that were sealed after Bernard's first wife withdrew her complaints. Financial records showing payments from Bernard's investigation business to current Cedar Falls Police Department personnel, and testimony from former colleagues who describe a pattern of harassment and intimidation that goes back decades." Frank realized that Martinez's investigation had uncovered exactly the kind of background information that could expose Bernard's true nature and explain how he had managed to avoid consequences for his behavior. If her findings were accurate and could be verified, they would provide the context needed to understand the current situation as part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated incident. "Ms. Martinez," Frank said, making a decision that could determine whether the media narrative worked for or against Jessica's safety. "Give me 5 minutes to discuss this with Jessica, then we'll talk." Frank Morrison was about to discover whether investigative journalism could serve as an ally in protecting domestic violence victims, or whether opening his door to media attention would provide Bernard with new opportunities to manipulate public opinion and destroy the credibility of anyone who threatened his carefully constructed facade. The war for Jessica's life was expanding beyond courtrooms and police stations into the realm of public opinion, where truth and fiction competed on equal terms, and victory often belonged to whoever told the most compelling story rather than whoever possessed the most accurate facts. Frank Morrison opened his front door to Linda Martinez, and within the first 5 minutes of conversation, he realized that Bernard Kellerman's carefully constructed facade was about to crumble under the weight of investigative journalism. Martinez spread a collection of documents across his dining room table while Jessica watched from the kitchen doorway, her expression mixing hope and terror at the prospect of Bernard's true nature being exposed. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Kellerman," Martinez began, opening a thick manila folder. "What I'm about to show you will explain why Bernard has been so confident about avoiding consequences for his actions. He's not just an abusive husband. He's been running a sophisticated criminal operation for over a decade." The first document Martinez placed on the table was a Chicago Police Department incident report from 2019, heavily redacted but clearly documenting domestic violence allegations against Bernard made by his first wife, Margaret Kellerman. The report described injuries consistent with physical assault, but it had been marked unfounded after Margaret withdrew her complaint just days before she died in what was ruled an accidental fall down the stairs of their home. Margaret Kellerman made 3 separate reports to Chicago PD about Bernard's violence, Martinez explained. Each time, the investigating officers were reassigned to different cases within 48 hours, and each time, Bernard's insurance investigation business received large cash payments from sources that I haven't been able to identify through normal financial records. Frank studied the documents with the analytical attention he had once applied to intelligence reports in combat zones, recognizing patterns that suggested systematic corruption rather than coincidental bureaucratic failures. "You're saying he was paying people to make these reports disappear?" "I'm saying the evidence strongly suggests that," Martinez replied carefully. "But it gets worse. Margaret Kellerman wasn't his first victim." The next set of documents revealed an even more disturbing pattern. Between 2015 and 2018, Bernard had been married to Carol Denning, a recently divorced nurse from Peoria who had disappeared without a trace 6 months after their wedding. The missing person investigation had been closed after Bernard provided evidence that Carol had been struggling with depression and had a history of threatening suicide. Carol's family never believed she would have killed herself, Martinez continued. They hired a private investigator who discovered that Bernard had emptied her bank accounts and sold her car within days of her disappearance. But by then the police had already moved on to other cases. Jessica spoke for the first time since Martinez had arrived, her voice barely above a whisper. "How many women has he done this to?" Martinez consulted her notes, her expression grim. "Based on marriage records and insurance investigation business receipts, I've identified at least 5 women who married Bernard and subsequently died, disappeared, or recanted domestic violence allegations under suspicious circumstances. Jessica, you're not his victim, you're his latest intended victim in what appears to be a pattern of serial abuse that has escalated to include murder." The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow as he understood that his intervention had prevented not just another beating, but likely Jessica's murder. Bernard hadn't been escalating toward potential homicide. He had been executing a plan that he had refined through multiple previous victims. "There's more," Martinez said, placing another set of documents on the table. "Bernard's insurance investigation business has been receiving contracts from local law enforcement agencies here in Cedar Falls, including payments for background checks on domestic violence complainants and their potential witnesses." Frank felt his blood pressure rising as he processed the implications. He's been using his professional relationships to investigate his own victims and the people trying to help them. Exactly. When you called police about domestic disturbances at the Kellerman residence, Bernard received copies of those reports within hours through his business relationship with the department. He knew exactly what evidence existed against him and who was providing information to law enforcement. Jessica sank into a chair at the dining room table, her face pale as she processed the scope of Bernard's operation. He always seemed to know things he shouldn't have known. When I talked to the doctor about my injuries, Bernard knew what I had said before I got home. When I called the domestic violence hotline, he confronted me about it the same day. Bernard has cultivated a network of contacts throughout the local criminal justice system, Martinez explained. Police officers, court clerks, social workers, even medical personnel who have access to confidential information. He's been operating like an intelligence agency, gathering information about his victims and potential threats to his operations. Frank's military training had taught him to recognize sophisticated enemy networks, but he had never encountered anything like this in civilian contexts. Bernard had essentially created a private surveillance and intimidation operation using the same institutions that were supposed to protect domestic violence victims. "Ms. Martinez," Frank said, "what kind of evidence do you have that would hold up in court?" Martinez smiled for the first time since arriving, pulling out a recording device and a stack of financial documents. "I've been investigating Bernard for 8 months, ever since Carol Denning's sister contacted me about her suspicions regarding her disappearance. I have recorded conversations with 3 of his police contacts discussing payments for information, financial records showing unexplained cash deposits into his business accounts, and testimony from 2 former employees who were fired for refusing to participate in what they recognized as illegal surveillance activities." Frank realized that Martinez's investigation had been running parallel to his own observations of Bernard's abuse, creating a comprehensive case that went far beyond simple domestic violence into federal crimes involving corruption, conspiracy, and potentially multiple homicides. "The problem," Martinez continued, "is that Bernard knows I've been investigating him. Yesterday, someone broke into my hotel room and attempted to steal my research files. Fortunately, I keep copies in multiple locations, but it's clear that Bernard's network includes people with the skills and authorization to conduct illegal searches." Jessica looked at Frank with growing alarm. "If Bernard knows about the investigation, what does that mean for our safety?" Frank had been wondering the same thing. A domestic abuser facing simple assault charges might be willing to accept plea bargains or negotiate reduced sentences. A serial killer whose entire criminal network was about to be exposed had nothing to lose and every incentive to eliminate witnesses before they could testify. "Ms. Martinez," Frank said, "what's your timeline for publishing this story?" The article goes live on the Des Moines Register website tomorrow morning, Martinez replied. But I wanted to give you both advance warning, because publication is going to trigger a federal investigation that will put you at the center of a much larger case than domestic violence. Frank understood the implications immediately. Once Martinez's story was published, Bernard would know that his decades of criminal activity were about to be exposed. If he was going to eliminate witnesses, he would have to act within hours of publication, before federal agents could take him into protective custody. Jessica, Frank said, we need to relocate you tonight. Somewhere Bernard and his contacts can't predict or access. Where? Jessica asked. If Bernard has contacts throughout local law enforcement, how do we know who we can trust? Martinez reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card. I've been working with FBI agent Sarah Kim from the Des Moines field office. She's been investigating political corruption in small Iowa towns, and Bernard's operation fits perfectly into her existing case. Agent Kim has arranged for federal protection for both of you starting tonight. Frank felt relief beginning to build, but his military experience had taught him to be suspicious of solutions that seemed too convenient. How do we know Agent Kim isn't compromised? If Bernard has contacts in local law enforcement, he might have relationships with federal agents too. Because Agent Kim has been investigating Bernard's police contacts for 6 months as part of a broader corruption probe, Martinez explained. She's the one who provided me with some of the financial documents that prove Bernard has been paying for confidential information. She's been waiting for enough evidence to move against the entire network. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Morrison, this is Agent Kim. Ms. Martinez should have provided you with my contact information. I have a team positioned near your residence. When you're ready, we can provide immediate transport to a secure location. Frank showed the message to Martinez, who nodded confirmation. That's her number. Agent Kim suggested that you both pack essential items for several days. Once the story breaks tomorrow, it will probably be unsafe for you to return home until Bernard and his associates are in custody. Frank looked at Jessica, seeing the exhaustion and fear in her face as she processed the reality that her escape from Bernard had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. She had found the courage to leave one abusive situation only to discover that she was a key witness in a federal case involving multiple homicides and systematic corruption. Jessica, Frank said gently, what do you want to do? Jessica was quiet. For a long moment, her expression cycling through the emotions Frank had come to recognize as her processing complex and dangerous decisions. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. I want to stop him, she said simply, not just from hurting me, but from hurting other women. If testifying against Bernard means other people are safe, then that's what I need to do. Frank felt a surge of pride at Jessica's courage, recognizing the transformation from victim to survivor, to advocate that represented the kind of moral growth his military service had taught him to respect above all other human qualities. Ms. Martinez, Frank said, tell Agent Kim we're ready. As they prepared to leave the house that had become Jessica's first safe haven, Frank reflected on how dramatically their situation had evolved. What had begun as a simple intervention to prevent domestic violence had become a federal case that could expose decades of criminal activity and corruption throughout Cedar Falls' criminal justice system. Frank Morrison had saved Jessica Kellerman's life, but Jessica's courage in speaking truth about her abuse was about to save the lives of women who didn't even know they were in danger from a sophisticated predator who had been perfecting his methods for over a decade. The war for Jessica's safety was expanding into a broader battle against institutionalized corruption that enabled predators to operate with impunity. And Frank Morrison, who had spent his military career protecting civilians from foreign enemies, was about to discover that Some of the most dangerous threats to innocent people came from within the very systems designed to protect them. 18 months after Frank Morrison heard Jessica's screams through his kitchen window, he stood in the witness box of the Federal District Court in Des Moines, facing the most important testimony of his civilian life. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of Bernard Kellerman's victims, women whose stories had finally found their voice through Jessica's courage to survive and speak truth. Bernard sat at the defendant's table in an orange federal prison jumpsuit, his transformation from respectable retiree to convicted felon complete. The confidence and manipulation that had defined his decades of criminal activity had been replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed under the weight of evidence he could no longer suppress or explain away. "Mr. Morrison," Federal Prosecutor Amanda Hayes began, "please tell the court what you observed on the morning of November 15th that led to your intervention at the Kellerman residence." Frank's testimony was the capstone of an 18-month federal investigation that had uncovered one of the most sophisticated domestic violence and corruption networks in Iowa's history. Bernard's conviction on federal charges of racketeering, conspiracy, mail fraud, and first-degree murder had already been secured through the overwhelming evidence Linda Martinez had uncovered and the testimony of corrupt officials who had cooperated in exchange for reduced sentences. But Frank's role as the person who had actually witnessed Bernard's escalation to attempted murder made his testimony crucial for establishing the pattern of violence that connected Bernard's current charges to the deaths of his previous victims. "I heard screaming that indicated someone was in immediate physical danger," Frank said, his voice carrying the clear authority of someone who had learned to deliver critical information under pressure. "When I looked through the kitchen window, I observed Mr. Kellerman threatening his wife with what appeared to be a weapon while she was injured on the floor. Based on my military training and the evidence of ongoing violence, I assessed that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent serious bodily harm or death." Frank's testimony had been carefully prepared to emphasize his qualifications as an observer of violence and his appropriate response to an emergency situation. The defense's attempts to portray him as an unstable veteran had been thoroughly discredited by Dr. Sarah Kim's psychological evaluation and the testimony of his former commanding officers. But Prosecutor Hayes wanted to ensure that the jury understood Frank's actions as those of a trained professional responding to a genuine crisis. "Mr. Morrison," Hayes continued, "based on your military experience, how would you characterize the level of violence you observed that morning?" Frank looked directly at the jury, 12 citizens who had listened to weeks of testimony about Bernard's decades of abuse, manipulation, and murder. "In my assessment, Mrs. Kellerman was minutes away from being killed. The defendant's behavior, the victim's condition, and the escalation pattern I had observed over previous months all indicated that this was not a domestic dispute, but an attempted homicide." Jessica, who had testified the previous week, sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table. Her transformation over the past 18 months had been remarkable. From the terrified, isolated woman Frank had found bleeding on her kitchen floor to the confident advocate who had become the face of domestic violence survivors throughout Iowa. Jessica's testimony had been the emotional centerpiece of the trial, but it was supported by overwhelming physical evidence that Bernard's defense team had been unable to challenge. FBI forensics experts had found DNA evidence linking Bernard to the deaths of both Margaret Kellerman and Carol Denning, whose body had been discovered in a remote area outside Peoria after one of Bernard's former associates provided information about the location in exchange for immunity. The corruption network that had enabled Bernard's crimes for over a decade had been systematically dismantled through the federal investigation. 3 Cedar Falls police officers had been convicted of accepting bribes to provide confidential information. 2 court clerks had pled guilty to tampering with domestic violence reports, and a social services supervisor had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for selling client information to Bernard's investigation business. The scope of Bernard's criminal enterprise had shocked even experienced federal investigators. FBI agent Sarah Kim, who had led the investigation, testified that Bernard had essentially created a private intelligence network that allowed him to monitor his victims' communications, track their movements, and eliminate potential witnesses. Through a combination of intimidation, bribery, and violence, but perhaps the most damning evidence against Bernard had come from his own records. When federal agents searched his house and business offices, they discovered detailed files on dozens of potential victims, including psychological profiles, financial information, and strategic plans for isolating and controlling women he had identified as suitable targets. Jessica's file had been the most comprehensive, documenting Bernard's 18-month campaign to systematically destroy her independence and self-worth while positioning himself as her only source of security and support. The file included transcripts of conversations he had recorded without her knowledge, photographs of her injuries from previous assaults, and a timeline that showed his planned escalation toward what he called final resolution, the euphemism he used for murder. Frank's intervention had interrupted that timeline just hours before Bernard intended to implement the final phase of his plan. FBI analysis of Bernard's communications showed that he had scheduled a meeting with his Chicago contact the day after Frank's intervention, apparently to arrange for disposal of what would have been Jessica's body. The revelation that Jessica had been literally hours away from death when Frank heard her screams added devastating weight to the prosecution's case. Bernard hadn't been caught in a moment of uncontrolled rage. He had been executing a carefully planned murder that represented the culmination of years of psychological torture. "Mr. Morrison," Prosecutor Hayes said, concluding her direct examination, "if you had not intervened on November 15th, what do you believe would have happened to Jessica Kellerman?" Frank looked at Bernard, seeing no remorse or recognition of his victim's humanity in the older man's eyes. "Based on the evidence and the defendant's pattern of behavior with previous victims, I believe Jessica would have been murdered that morning. My intervention was the only thing standing between her and death." Defense attorney Harold Brennan's cross-examination focused on Frank's mental health history and his decision to enter Bernard's house without legal authority. But the jury had already heard extensive expert testimony, establishing that Frank's PTSD diagnosis made him more qualified, not less qualified, to recognize and respond to life-threatening violence. More importantly, Bernard's own actions following his arrest had thoroughly discredited any claim that he was the victim of Frank's misinterpretation. The evidence of bribing police officers, intimidating witnesses, and attempting to destroy evidence had established Bernard as exactly the kind of sophisticated criminal that Frank's military training had prepared him to identify and confront. When the jury returned their verdict after less than 4 hours of deliberation, their findings validated everything Frank and Jessica had endured over the past 18 months. Bernard Kellerman was convicted on all counts, including first-degree murder in the deaths of Margaret Kellerman and Carol Denning, racketeering conspiracy, and federal domestic violence charges that carried a mandatory life sentence without possibility of parole. Judge Patricia Rodriguez, who had presided over the trial with the careful attention of someone who understood its broader implications for domestic violence prosecution, delivered the sentence with appropriate gravity. "Mr. Kellerman," Judge Rodriguez said, "your crimes represent a systematic campaign of violence against vulnerable women that was enabled by corruption of the very institutions designed to protect them. Your actions have not only destroyed the lives of your direct victims, but have undermined public trust in law enforcement and social services that are essential for protecting domestic violence survivors." Bernard showed no emotion as he received multiple life sentences that would ensure he died in federal prison. But Frank, watching from the gallery beside Jessica, felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond simple justice. The man who had planned to end his own life 18 months earlier had instead saved multiple lives and exposed a criminal network that might have continued operating indefinitely without his intervention. As they left the courthouse, Frank and Jessica were surrounded by reporters asking about their plans and their feelings about the verdict. But Frank's attention was focused on a different group, the family members of Bernard's victims who had finally received the justice and closure they had been denied for years. Margaret Kellerman's sister Patricia approached Frank and Jessica with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Margaret tried to get help so many times, but nobody listened. If you hadn't been there for Jessica, we never would have known what really happened to my sister." Carol Denning's daughter, Rebecca, had flown in from California for the sentencing. She hugged Jessica with the desperate gratitude of someone who had spent years wondering whether her mother had abandoned her or been murdered. "You gave my mother a voice," Rebecca said. "By surviving and speaking out, you made sure her story was finally heard." Frank understood that their ordeal had meaning beyond their personal survival. Jessica's courage in testifying had not only secured justice for Bernard's other victims, but had established legal precedents that would make it easier for future domestic violence survivors to seek help and hold their abusers accountable. The federal investigation had also resulted in systemic reforms throughout Iowa's criminal justice system. New protocols required independent oversight of domestic violence investigations, mandatory training for law enforcement officers on recognizing sophisticated abuse patterns, and stronger protections for confidential information that abusers had been using to track and intimidate their victims. Most importantly, Jessica had become a powerful advocate for domestic violence survivors, working with legislators to strengthen protective laws and speaking at conferences about the psychological tactics used by sophisticated abusers. Her insights into Bernard's manipulation techniques had been incorporated into training programs for social workers, law enforcement officers, and medical personnel who worked with abuse victims. Frank had used his experience with the case to establish a nonprofit organization that provided security consulting and protection services for domestic violence survivors in situations where traditional shelters were inadequate. The organization employed military veterans with relevant skills, creating meaningful civilian missions for soldiers who were struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. As they walked out of the courthouse into the Iowa sunshine, Frank reflected on the conversation he and Jessica had shared the night before the sentencing. She had asked him what he thought Helen would have said about everything that had happened since her death. Frank had considered the question carefully before answering. Helen had always believed that people's true character was revealed not by their successes, but by how they responded to loss and tragedy. She would have been proud that Frank had found purpose in protecting others, rather than retreating into isolation and despair. But more than that, Helen would have recognized that saving Jessica's life had saved Frank's life as well. By giving him someone to protect and a mission that mattered, Jessica had provided Frank with the reason to live that he had lost when Helen died. "What's next?" Jessica asked as they reached Frank's truck, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to plan her own future rather than simply react to circumstances imposed by others. Frank smiled, thinking about the 3 domestic violence cases their foundation was currently working on, the legislative testimony he was scheduled to provide about veteran services, and the training conference Jessica was organizing for law enforcement personnel. "Next, we keep saving lives," Frank said, using the phrase that had become their private mission statement. "One intervention at a time." Jessica nodded, understanding that their work would continue as long as there were predators like Bernard, who used sophistication and institutional corruption to prey on vulnerable people. But they had proven that even the most carefully constructed criminal operations could be defeated by ordinary people who refused to look away when their neighbors needed help. Frank Morrison had gone to his field to die 18 months earlier, convinced that his life had no remaining purpose or value. Instead, he had discovered that sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of something much more important. As they drove back towards Cedar Falls, Frank understood that the most meaningful victories were not won on foreign battlefields, but in suburban kitchens where evil was confronted by people who had the courage to act when action was needed most. The war for Jessica Kellerman's life had ended in complete victory. But their broader mission of protecting the innocent would continue for as long as there were people willing to hear cries for help and brave enough to answer them. Frank Morrison, veteran of foreign wars and domestic battles, had finally found his way home to a purpose worthy of the life Helen had taught him to value. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.